What is psychology? Psychology is the study of human behaviour, the mind and the
It's
brain.
not about mind reading, it's not about Darren Brown, it's not about trying to find out why people have committed a crime that they've committed. It's more looking at research, and I can't remember what else I want to say, so I'm just going to be like this. Hello, my name's Sam,
And I'm Emily.
and we both teach psychology here at Burnley College.
Yes, we do.
I don't know why I'm looking at that one, actually looking at this one.
Okay, so the A-level course is linear, so this means you will sit your final A-level qualifications at the end of the 2 years. So your first year will be a case of getting your AS qualification, and that will help towards giving you your predicted grades, and also we'll put that on your UCAS application. But your final A-level scores will be at the end of the 2 years.
So in first year, you've got 2 exams. The first exam is all about research methods. So you'll look at all this stuff in here. So it's looking at different research methods that you can conduct to find out about people's behaviours. So for example, you might do an observation, which is watching people and writing down what you've seen. It could be an experiment. So you've actually made participants do something and then you're reporting on what they've said and done. It could be a self-report, so like a questionnaire or an interview, and you'd ask them to do a question and you'd analyse what they've said. And we look at kind of the strengths and the weaknesses of those different research methods in telling us accurately about human behaviour. So we're trying to build basically evidence for what we're saying about behaviour. And then the other one is, so this is an example of one of the booklets that you'll get. We do different approaches in psychology, so this is individual differences, looking at why everybody is unique, because generally in psychology what we do is we club everyone together and we say why they're similar, so everyone's got a similar memory and things like that. But the individual differences looks at, you know, individual reasoning for why they've got that behaviour. So for example, we look at mental disorders. So Freud is a really famous study that we look at, and we get you to fill in this big sheet to study all about Freud. So you'll find out, you know, the background, all Freud's theories. I said Freud wrong then, Freud's theories about the mind, about personality. We have a look at how the study was actually done. So Freud was sent letters from Little Hans's dad. And it was a case study, so it's an in-depth study of one individual over a long period of time. We have a look at the results, so there was some dreams and fantasies, and then we conclude why Little Hans has had a phobia of horses, and it's all to do with having the Oedipus complex, and you'll find out what all that is about when you start.
One of the other approaches that we look at is a social approach to psychology.
Oh, I'm zooming in.
Oh, she zoomed in. Hello. Which is very much about how we look at social groups and how the environment affects our behaviour. So within the social approach to psychology, our key theme is looking at obedience to authority. And we have 2 studies, so you always have a classic study and a contemporary study. So the classic study we look at is the Milgram study. A very well-known psychologist called Stanley Milgram conducted a study to prove his idea that Germans were different. So it was this idea that the reason why mass genocide and the Holocaust happened during the war was because German people were evil. Okay, so he tested it in this really crazy experiment where he brought participants in, led them to believe they were doing this teacher learning experiment, but actually what he was interested in was how obedient they were. So he set up this scenario with a pretend electric shock generator, and he got these participants to pretend that they were administering electric shocks to the learners in the other room who weren't really there. So whilst they were doing this, they were genuinely believing that they were administering electricity, when really it was all just a set-up experiment in a lab. Even though it's a controlled observation, that's a real research method. So what happened was Milgram got an idea for how obedient people really were, and he found that 65% of the participants went up to 450 volts, which was the fatal amount which could kill somebody. So it was quite shocking really at the time to find that. And then we look at the modern study, which is by someone called Bocciaro, which is also looking at obedience, but this time he builds on Milgram's research by also including disobedience and whistleblowing. So what he did was he led people to believe that they were basically analysing this other study and had to say whether they thought it was good or not. Whistleblowing is when you report things to higher authorities, and he found that actually people think that they're more likely to whistleblow and be disobedient than they are, when actually people are quite obedient. And and just go along with it. So another couple of really interesting studies, for the social
Another
approach.
approach that you have a look at in first year is the biological approach. So looking more about how your brain structure, your hormones and your genes affect your behaviour. So one of the studies that you have a look at is called Sperry. Now Sperry had a look at people who had epilepsy, but it couldn't be controlled with medication, so it was very severe. They were having seizures, constantly throughout the day, affecting the quality of life. So what they did was what's called a split brain procedure. So if we have a look at the real brain here, this bit in the middle and also this bit here. So if we open this up, oh, this is awkward. I want to break it. So we've got here the corpus callosum. It's a thick, dense band of nerves, and basically what Sperry did was, well, he didn't do it. They'd already had a split brain procedure, so it's a natural experiment, naturally occurring IV. That's right, isn't it? Quasi, yeah. So they'd had that severed, so that basically the epilepsy would be controlled in one hemisphere of the brain. And what Sperry wanted to see was, what does each hemisphere do? Because if you've got somebody that has a split brain, you can then investigate what each of those hemispheres do. So what they found was that because it had been split, the left hemisphere controls the right hand side of the body, the right hemisphere controls the left hand side of the body, and you have language in your left hemisphere. So when they showed on a screen two objects, one in the left visual field and one in the right visual field, anything that was seen in the left visual field could not be said because it was processed by the right hemisphere and there's no language in there. So the people would say that they couldn't see it. And then anything that was in the right visual field could be said by the person. So they would say, they'd think that they'd seen that one, but they hadn't seen the other one. When if you gave them a pen in their hand, they'd be able to draw it. So even though they claim that they haven't seen anything, when you give them a pen to draw it, they can actually draw it. So it's like two parts of the brain are doing completely different things.
Okay. Pow! Sock it to him!
Throw it up in the air.
So this is one of our other studies, not quite like that, by a researcher called Bandura, who was interested in whether...
Hi, Delia.
Is it continuing?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a study by someone called Bandura, who was interested in whether children imitate their role models. So, he postulated a theory called social learning theory, I'm out of breath, which is this idea that children will imitate role models for all sorts of behaviour. And he was particularly interested in aggression. Now, during the 1960s, this is when televisions and things like that were starting to come into the homes, so children were witnessing things that could perhaps be considered more violent. So he set up an experiment type study where he had adults basically beating up what we call a bobo doll. Now, it had a face, so it looked like a clown, using acts of verbal and physical aggression. So they were doing things like throwing it up in the air, punching it, saying things like, sock it to him. Okay, this was an American study. And he was interested to see whether the children would imitate that behaviour when left alone with a bobo doll. And what he found was, when the children were left alone with the doll, they would imitate the same sort of behaviours as the videos of the adults that they'd earlier witnessed. So, for example, he found that boys were more likely to imitate aggressive acts than girls. So it proved this theory of social learning theory that if we observe a role model, we interpret that behaviour, and then we are likely to imitate it. So from there, we can explain all sorts of behaviour, particularly in child development.
Although it's not in our entry requirement, psychology is full of maths, so you'll need a calculator, and we do lots of things like statistical tests. We do means, medians, modes and ranges because we're more scientific. We're trying to look for actual evidence of the theories for why people behave in the way that they do. So we kind of need those numbers to support our theories. So you have to be able to draw a pie chart, you have to be able to draw a scatter graph and interpret those. You need to be looking at tables of data and see how they support what we're saying. So if maths is not for you, then psychology is probably not your best subject.
Yep. So in year 2, it's slightly different to your AS year in that you sit 3 exams at the end of the year as opposed to 2. Now, the first 2 exams are exactly the same as the exams that you sit in AS. So it will be the research methods and the psychological themes through core studies paper that you sit again in year 2. However, instead of being an hour and a half, in year 2, those papers will then be 2 hours. So it's really building on those skills from the first year. In your psychological themes through core studies paper, you'll also learn another 10 core studies to build upon the 10 that you've learned in year 1. And then you've got a third paper as well. This is also 2 hours, but this is applied psychology. So this is completely new content that you'll learn in year 2. So your third paper is looking at mental health. You're going to look at child psychology and also criminal psychology. And the styles of questions will be slightly different too. So for example, you'll have to be able to do essay questions and apply research from different studies into exam style questions with evaluation as well. So it's a little bit different in year.
So the issues in mental health, you get another little book like this, and in here what you study is things like the historical context of mental health. So you'll have a look at how were people treated with mental health disorders across time points. You know, where has it come from to have mental disorders? How are they actually diagnosed? How do they use the DSM-5 and the ICD-10 to come up with a diagnosis of the mental disorders that we now know? So for example, you'll have a look at affective disorders like depression and bipolar. You'll have a look at psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, and you'll also have a look at anxiety disorders such as OCD and phobias, and just anxiety in general. So we have a look at kind of how do you classify them, what are the characteristics of each of those disorders, and then we'll also have a look at what are the explanations for them, because there's many different ways that you can explain disorders. So we can go down the biological route, so that the imbalances in dopamine in the brain, for example, and the use of serotonin, what's it called?
Active serotonin reuptake inhibitors.
That's it. So we have a look at those and how they balance mood and things, so to prevent things like depression. And then we also have a look at more of kind of a cognitive explanation, so the fact that it's your thoughts that are perhaps causing the disorder, and how do we address those, because that's conflicting to what the biological approach is suggesting. We also have a look at what's called the anti-psychiatry movement, the suggestion that all these disorders that we have are actually not real, or that they are real but we don't classify them right. You know, the studies such as Rosenhan, who sent people into a mental health institute saying that they'd heard voices, empty, thud and hollow, heard of a voice of the same gender. They got admitted into hospital with schizophrenia, 7 of them, 8 of them, the other one had bipolar, and they didn't have anything wrong with them, so they should never have been there in the first place. And when they were in there, because they'd been diagnosed with this label, they were treated, as being insane was the terminology in those days. And that's worrying that people can be, considered to be acting abnormally. They were saying they were engaging in abnormal writing behaviour, when actually they were making notes because they were researchers. So it's worrying that, people couldn't tell the difference between who was sane and insane. So we have a look at that as part of that module. We hope that you found that useful.
And if you've got any questions about anything that we've covered or anything in the course, please feel free to ask. All 3 of us are in the room. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.